the years leading up to the Great War, as nuclear tensions escalated and the world teetered on the edge of apocalypse, millions of Americans placed their faith in a single corporation's promise of salvation. Vault-Tec, the company that marketed itself as humanity's last hope, convinced the government and the public that it could preserve civilization through an ambitious network of underground shelters designed to outlast nuclear annihilation. But Vault-Tec was not what it seemed. Behind the cheerful promotional materials, behind the reassuring promises of safety and survival, behind the iconic Vault Boy mascot giving his optimistic thumbs up, lay something far darker. Vault-Tec's leadership had transformed the greatest civil defense project in human history into the largest human experimentation program ever conceived, deliberately designing most of their vaults to fail, to torture, to transform their inhabitants into data points in experiments that would never be analyzed because the people who commissioned them would be dead. This is the story of Vault-Tec, not the sanitized corporate history they presented to the public, not the patriotic narrative of American ingenuity protecting its citizens, but the actual truth of how a private corporation gained the power to seal thousands of people in underground laboratories, how they used that power with calculated cruelty, and how their legacy poisoned the wasteland for centuries after the company itself ceased to exist. Before Vault-Tec became synonymous with survival shelters and human experimentation, it was simply another corporation navigating the increasingly militarized and authoritarian landscape of mid-21st century America. The exact origins of the company are murky. Corporate records from this era are fragmentary, and Vault-Tec itself had reasons to obscure its early history. But we know that by at least 2031, Vault-Tec existed as an established entity with sufficient resources and connections to acquire and operate significant facilities. In 2031, Vault-Tec acquired Vault-Tec University in Morgantown, Appalachia. This wasn't just a corporate training center or a technical school for engineers. It was a full university, an institution designed to create the next generation of Vault-Tec personnel, to indoctrinate students into the company's ideology, to produce the scientists, administrators, and overseers who would eventually manage the Vault network. The university's curriculum was telling. Students learned advanced nuclear engineering, certainly, and vault construction techniques and radiation safety protocols. But they also learned corporate philosophy, studied population management theories, absorbed lessons about the necessity of control and the primacy of data over individual human welfare. Vault-Tec University was creating true believers, people who would internalize the company's values so thoroughly that they could implement horrific experiments without questioning their purpose or morality. The university also served a public relations function. Vault-Tec positioned itself as a leader in civil defense and nuclear preparedness, a responsible corporate citizen contributing to national security and public safety. The company sponsored research, published papers on fallout protection, offered scholarships to promising students. It was building a reputation, establishing itself as the obvious choice when the government eventually decided it needed to do something about the growing nuclear threat. In this early era, before Project Safehouse, Vault-Tec's business model focused on advanced nuclear-age consumer and defense technology. They manufactured radiation detectors for home use, marketed fallout shelter kits for private citizens, developed protective equipment for civil defense organizations. It was profitable work, riding the wave of nuclear anxiety that was sweeping America as the resource wars intensified and the geopolitical situation deteriorated. But the company's leadership had larger ambitions. They understood that consumer products and small-scale civil defense contracts were nothing compared to the potential of a government-funded, nationwide shelter program. They began positioning themselves for that opportunity, building relationships with federal officials, establishing their expertise, and, most critically, developing the corporate infrastructure and ideological framework that would allow them to do what they eventually did: turn survival into experimentation, protection into torture, salvation into damnation. The branding during this period was deliberately constructed to maximize public trust and minimize scrutiny. Vault-Tec created the Vault Boy mascot, that cheerful cartoon figure giving his thumbs up, his smile never wavering, even when illustrated next to warnings about radiation exposure or nuclear detonation. Vault Boy appeared everywhere, in training materials, promotional posters, safety manuals, advertisements. He was friendly, reassuring, quintessentially American in his can-do optimism. The genius of Vault Boy as propaganda was that he normalized nuclear apocalypse. He made the unthinkable seem manageable, transformed existential terror into a problem that could be solved through proper preparation and corporate expertise. When Vault Boy demonstrated how to use a Geiger counter or showed the proper way to seal a vault door, he suggested that nuclear war was just another challenge that American ingenuity and private enterprise could overcome. This branding extended into every aspect of Vault-Tec's public presence. Their promotional materials emphasized safety, efficiency, and national security. Their corporate culture, at least as presented to the outside world, was aggressively patriotic, technocratic, and focused on the common good. They positioned themselves not as profit-seeking capitalists, but as essential partners in national survival. Corporations, citizens who placed America's future above quarterly earnings. Of course, this was performance. Behind the cheerful branding and patriotic rhetoric, Vault-Tec's leadership was already thinking about the vaults not as shelters, but as laboratories, not as humanitarian projects, but as unprecedented opportunities to gather data about human behavior under conditions that no ethical review board would ever approve. But that truth remained hidden, concealed behind Vault Boy's smile and the company's carefully crafted public image. The transition to full defense megacorporation began in earnest during the 2050s, as the resource wars escalated and nuclear conflict transformed from distant possibility to imminent probability. The United States government, facing the reality that millions of Americans would die in any nuclear exchange, began seriously considering civil defense measures beyond the token shelters and duck and cover drills that characterized earlier approaches. Various proposals circulated through Washington: dispersed shelter networks, evacuation plans, hardened bunkers for essential personnel. But Vault-Tec had positioned itself to offer something more comprehensive: a complete, turnkey solution to national survival. They proposed constructing a network of large, sophisticated underground facilities that could house significant populations for extended periods, preserving not just lives, but entire communities, maintaining something resembling civilization rather than just keeping people alive until radiation levels dropped. The government was receptive. By the early to mid-2050s, amid resource conflicts and rising nuclear tensions, federal authorities commissioned Vault-Tec under what became known as Project Safehouse to design and construct a nationwide system of subterranean vault shelters intended to safeguard a portion of the civilian population. The official contract described the vaults as large fallout shelters jointly operated by Vault-Tec and federal authorities for long-term survival and the continuation of human civilization after nuclear war. It was presented as the largest civil defense initiative in human history, a public-private partnership that would ensure America's survival even if the worst happened. Congress appropriated massive funding. The public was informed in general terms about the program. Lottery systems were established to select vault residents. It seemed, on the surface, like exactly what it claimed to be, a genuine attempt to save as many people as possible. But the reality of Project Safehouse was fundamentally different from its public presentation. The contract between Vault-Tec and the government contained provisions that granted the corporation extraordinary latitude in vault design and operation. Vault-Tec would have control over experimental parameters, over what information was shared with vault residents, over how vaults were actually managed once sealed. The government, for its part, would provide funding, regulatory exemption from normal safety and ethical oversight, and, most critically, secrecy. Why did the government agree to these terms? The answer lies in understanding the pre-war American state in its final decades. This was not a functioning democracy concerned with citizen welfare. This was an authoritarian oligarchy, a military-industrial complex that had achieved complete capture of governmental authority, a system where corporations and federal agencies were essentially merged into a single entity pursuing goals that had nothing to do with public benefit. The government officials who approved Vault-Tec's contract weren't being deceived. They knew, or strongly suspected, that the vaults would be used for experimentation. They approved this because they shared Vault-Tec's fundamental ideology, that individual human lives mattered less than data, that ethics were obstacles to progress, that the kind of research Vault-Tec proposed could never be conducted under normal circumstances, and was therefore valuable precisely because it was monstrous. There was also a practical calculation. The government understood that saving everyone was impossible. There wasn't funding for enough legitimate shelters, wasn't time to construct facilities for hundreds of millions of people. So they made a choice: save some people in genuine shelters as control groups and use everyone else as experimental subjects. It was efficient in a horrifying way. If civilization was going to collapse anyway, at least gather some data from the collapse. If millions were going to die in vaults, at least make their deaths scientifically productive. Vault-Tec's corporate philosophy shifted fully into a defense megacorporation role during this period. The company accepted extensive government funding and secrecy, tied its brand completely to national survival, and internally began treating human beings as long-term assets and variables in controlled environments. The language in internal documents from this era is telling. Vault residents were subjects, populations were samples, death was data loss or expected attrition. The humanity had been completely extracted from how Vault-Tec thought about the people whose lives they controlled. This dehumanization was necessary for what came next. You couldn't implement the societal preservation program if you thought of Vault residents as people with rights, with dignity, with inherent worth. You had to think of them as numbers, as experimental units, as resources to be expended in pursuit of knowledge. Vault-Tec's leadership cultivated this mindset deliberately, hiring personnel who could embrace it, promoting those who demonstrated the necessary moral flexibility, and creating a corporate culture where questioning the ethics of what they were doing was professionally and socially unacceptable. As construction ramped up through the mid-2060s, Vault-Tec and its government partners formalized what they called the Societal Preservation Program. The name was Orwellian in its dishonesty. There was nothing about preserving society in most of what the program entailed. It was a continent-wide matrix of social, psychological, medical, and technological experiments on unwitting populations. A systematic program of human experimentation that dwarfed anything previously attempted in scale and scope. The numbers tell part of the story. Out of 122 constructed vaults, only 17 were designated as true control or baseline vaults, intended primarily for genuine preservation and relatively normal conditions. 17. That means 105 vaults, the vast majority of the network, were assigned specific experimental parameters that deliberately stressed, distorted, or destroyed their societies. Think about what that means. Vault-Tec and the government knew that most vaults would fail, that most people assigned to vaults would suffer and likely die from the experiments being conducted on them. They designed it that way. They could have built 122 functioning shelters and actually saved the people who trusted them. Instead, they built 17 shelters and 105 laboratories, deliberately sacrificing thousands of lives for data that, in most cases, would never be analyzed because the war would destroy the infrastructure needed to collect and process it. The experiments themselves varied wildly in design and intended outcome. Some were sociological, vaults filled with people of deliberately incompatible ideologies, or with extreme wealth inequality, or with no government structure, or with rotating leadership to create instability. These were designed to test how societies fractured under stress, how quickly cooperation broke down, what conditions produced the most dramatic failures. Others were psychological, vaults where the overseer was secretly replaced by a computer, or where residents believed they were still in imminent danger, or where they were exposed to subliminal messaging, or where privacy was completely eliminated. These tested individual mental resilience, collective psychological breaking points, the effectiveness of various control and manipulation techniques. Medical experiments were particularly cruel. Vaults exposed to sustained low-level radiation to test long-term effects. Vaults where residents were deliberately infected with diseases to study progression and treatment. Vaults where medical care was withheld to establish baseline mortality rates. Vaults where experimental drugs were administered without consent or even knowledge. Some experiments seemed designed purely to satisfy someone's curiosity about edge cases. A vault populated entirely by one gender. A vault where one person was deliberately selected to be different from everyone else. A vault where residents were told they would only be sealed for 10 years, but were kept for far longer. A vault where children were separated from parents and raised by robots. Corporate documents and later in-game records show that Vault-Tec's leadership regarded mass loss of human life and societal collapse within individual vaults as acceptable or even desirable outcomes in pursuit of data about human behavior, adaptability, and technology under extreme conditions. They weren't hoping the experiments would work out well for the residents. They were hoping for dramatic failures, for complete breakdowns, for outcomes so extreme that they would generate unprecedented data. This wasn't science in any legitimate sense. Real scientific research requires ethical oversight, informed consent, peer review, replicability. Vault-Tec's experiments had none of these. They were isolated, unreviewable, conducted on subjects who didn't know they were being experimented on and couldn't refuse participation. The data generated would be contaminated by countless variables, impossible to analyze properly without control populations that didn't exist, and ultimately useless for any practical application. But usefulness wasn't really the point. The Societal Preservation Program existed because it could exist, because Vault-Tec had been given unlimited power over thousands of human lives and chose to use that power in the most monstrous way imaginable. It was institutional evil enabled by corporate structure, government complicity, and the complete moral bankruptcy of everyone involved in its design and implementation. The psychological profile of people who could design and implement the Societal Preservation Program is worth considering. These weren't sadists or psychopaths, at least not in the clinical sense. They were educated professionals, many with advanced degrees from prestigious institutions. They had families, social lives, probably considered themselves good people. But they had internalized an ideology that placed abstract knowledge above human welfare, that valued data over dignity, that could look at a plan to seal children in a vault and expose them to psychological torture and see only an interesting experimental design rather than an atrocity. This is what corporate and governmental power does when completely unchecked by ethics, law, or public accountability. It creates systems where ordinary people can implement extraordinary evil while telling themselves they're serving progress, national security, scientific advancement. Vault-Tec's personnel probably believed they were doing important work, that the sacrifices were justified by the potential knowledge gained, that individual suffering mattered less than the greater good of understanding human behavior. They were wrong. The suffering they inflicted served no purpose beyond satisfying their curiosity and demonstrating their power. The knowledge they sought was either trivial or could have been obtained through ethical means. The greater good they invoked was a fiction, a justification for cruelty that served only their own interests and egos. But they had constructed an institutional framework that made these rationalizations seem reasonable, that rewarded implementing experiments and punished questioning them, that made monstrosity routine. While the Societal Preservation Program represented Vault-Tec's moral nadir, the company's technological achievements were genuinely impressive, if deeply compromised by the purposes they served. Through the 2060s and into 2077, Vault-Tec developed or co-branded several critical technologies that became essential to Vault life and, eventually, wasteland exploration. The Pip-Boy personal information processor was perhaps Vault-Tec's most visible technological legacy. These wrist-mounted computers, distributed to Vault residents, provided access to personal data, Vault systems, mapping and navigation, inventory management, and eventually combat assistance through the Vault-Tec Assisted Targeting System, or VATS, integration. The Pip-Boy was functional, relatively durable, and surprisingly versatile given its pre-war origin. But the Pip-Boy was also a surveillance device. It tracked user location, monitored vital signs, recorded all interactions and transactions, and provided Vault-Tec and overseer authorities with complete information about residents' activities. The convenience and functionality were real, but they came at the cost of total privacy loss. Every Pip-Boy was a leash, a way for Vault-Tec to maintain awareness and control over populations that might otherwise resist their authority. The Garden of Eden Creation Kit, or GEC, represented Vault-Tec's most ambitious technological achievement. A device supposedly capable of seeding or restoring post-war environments, transforming wasteland into habitable territory through rapid terraforming. The GEC was presented as the key to reclaiming the surface, the tool that would allow Vault residents to rebuild civilization rather than just survive underground indefinitely. The reality of GEC functionality was more complicated. Some units worked as advertised, genuinely transforming local environments through fusion-powered matter replication and reorganization. Others were less miraculous, sophisticated but ultimately limited tools that could provide resources but not actually terraform large areas. And some were apparently designed to fail or produce unexpected results, because even in their most optimistic technology, Vault-Tec couldn't resist the urge to experiment. Vault-Tec collaborated extensively with other major pre-war firms, particularly Robco Industries, integrating computing, robotics, and automation into Vault infrastructure. Robco provided the mainframe computers that controlled life support, the robots that maintained facilities, the automated systems that could theoretically keep vaults functioning even without human oversight. This partnership was mutually beneficial. Robco gained massive contracts and access to Vault-Tec's research, while Vault-Tec acquired technology they couldn't develop in-house. But this collaboration also meant that Robco was complicit in Vault-Tec's experiments. Robco engineers knew what the vaults were being designed for, understood that their robots and computers would be used to implement human experimentation, and proceeded anyway because the contracts were lucrative and the moral questions were someone else's problem. The corporate ecosystem of pre-war America had thoroughly corrupted everyone involved, creating networks of complicity where everyone could point to someone else as ultimately responsible, while they all contributed to the same monstrous outcomes. Across the Vault network, Vault-Tec specified core design elements that became standard. Self-contained life support systems capable of sustaining populations indefinitely. Strict overseer hierarchies that concentrated authority in single individuals. Pervasive surveillance and logging systems that recorded everything. And heavily scripted emergency protocols that gave the corporation and its proxies fine-grained control over information and population management. These design choices reflected Vault-Tec's priorities. The life support systems worked well because Vault-Tec needed residents alive to generate useful experimental data. The overseer hierarchy existed to ensure someone could implement experimental directives, even if most residents objected. The surveillance was comprehensive because data collection was the entire point. The information control was absolute because residents who knew they were being experimented on might resist in ways that compromised the experiments. The aesthetic of Vault design, that retro-futuristic, clean, modular look that became iconic, was also deliberate. Vault-Tec wanted their facilities to feel safe, orderly, and optimistic. The Art Deco styling, the cheerful color schemes, the friendly signage all worked to create an environment that suggested competence and benevolence. It was branding extended into architecture, designed to make residents trust the systems that were actually designed to harm them. Even the layout of vaults served experimental purposes. Sections could be isolated, populations could be segregated, movement could be controlled. The standardized modular construction meant Vault-Tec could implement similar experiments in different locations, comparing results across populations. The medical bays were positioned centrally, facilitating the collection of biological samples and implementation of medical experiments. The overseer's office was isolated and secure, ensuring that authority figure could implement directives even against widespread resident resistance. Every technical choice Vault-Tec made was in service of their experimental program. There was no aspect of vault design that wasn't calculated to facilitate surveillance, control, and data collection. The corporation had thought through every detail, anticipated every potential obstacle, and engineered solutions that prioritized experimental integrity over resident welfare. The technological sophistication Vault-Tec demonstrated makes their moral failure even more damning. They were clearly capable of brilliant engineering and innovative design. If that talent had been directed toward actually saving people, toward building genuine shelters and developing technologies that benefited humanity, Vault-Tec could have been genuinely heroic. Instead, they used their capabilities to build better prisons, more effective torture devices, more sophisticated systems for implementing cruelty while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. On October 23, 2077, the Great War began and ended in a span of hours. The full-scale nuclear exchange between the United States and China, along with other nuclear powers entering the conflict, destroyed civilization in a day. The missiles flew, the bombs fell, and the world that Vault-Tec had promised to save ended in nuclear fire. As the air raid sirens wailed and the first reports of launches reached civil defense authorities, Vault-Tec's emergency protocols activated across the country. Selected citizens, those who had won lottery positions or purchased premium shelter access, rushed to their assigned vaults. Vault-Tec personnel, already positioned in facilities or scrambling to reach them, prepared to seal the massive doors and begin the long isolation. Many vaults sealed as intended. Residents made it inside, doors closed, life support activated, and the facilities began their designated experiments. These vaults functioned as Vault-Tec designed them, which for most meant functioning as laboratories rather than shelters, implementing the tortures that had been planned for them, destroying the people who had trusted Vault-Tec to save them. But many vaults never sealed at all. Some were incomplete, construction still ongoing when the bombs fell, workers and residents dying in the nuclear fire instead of being protected by the shelters they had built and trusted. Others experienced mechanical failures, doors jamming or systems failing at the critical moment. Some vaults were simply too far from population centers, unable to receive enough residents to justify sealing, their elaborate facilities sitting empty while people died trying to reach them. This chaos reflected pre-war mismanagement, funding issues, and work stoppages documented in scattered records. Vault-Tec had been paid to build 122 functional facilities, but corporate priorities had often diverged from actual construction timelines. Money was diverted to executive compensation and shareholder returns. Construction crews were shifted between projects based on political considerations rather than completion schedules. Quality control was sacrificed to meet deadlines or reduce costs. The result was that Vault-Tec failed even at the basic task of shelter construction, independent of their experimental atrocities. People who had been promised safety, who had paid for vault access or won lottery positions, died because Vault-Tec couldn't be bothered to actually finish the facilities or maintain them properly. The corporation's incompetence killed people just as surely as their deliberate experiments would kill others. Vault-Tec's corporate structure, executive leadership, and above-ground assets were effectively destroyed or rendered non-functional during the war. The executives who had designed the Societal Preservation Program, who had approved experiments and signed off on atrocities, died in the nuclear fire like everyone else. Their wealth didn't save them. Their power became meaningless. The corporation that had wielded such extraordinary authority over human life ceased to exist as a functioning entity within hours of the Great War's beginning. This left the Vault overseers and internal systems as the practical continuation of Vault-Tec's will and experiment directives. The overseers had been selected and trained specifically for this role. They were true believers in Vault-Tec's ideology, people who could implement experimental protocols without questioning their morality or purpose. They had sealed orders, detailed instructions about what experiments to conduct, and the authority to enforce compliance even against populations that might resist. In some vaults, overseers implemented their directives faithfully, conducting the experiments Vault-Tec had designed, maintaining surveillance, collecting data that no one would ever analyze. In others, overseers either couldn't or wouldn't follow their orders, some because the experiments were too monstrous even for them to stomach, others because resident populations discovered the truth and overthrew overseer authority. And in some vaults, overseers went beyond their directives, using their absolute power for personal gratification or developing their own variations on Vault-Tec's experiments. The diversity of overseer responses showed that even Vault-Tec's careful selection and training couldn't guarantee compliance. Human beings, even those indoctrinated into institutional evil, retained some capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning. But the system Vault-Tec had created was resilient enough that individual overseer choices often didn't matter. The vaults themselves, designed to facilitate experimentation, continued implementing their designated tortures regardless of who was nominally in charge. Many vaults began opening or failing during the first centuries after the war, and their experimental conditions directly created or transformed major post-war communities, factions, and biological populations across the wasteland. This was Vault-Tec's most enduring legacy, not the technology they developed or the data they collected, but the human cost of their experiments manifested in the suffering and transformation of populations they had sealed underground. Some control-oriented vaults, such as Vault 13, attempted genuine long-term habitation with minimal intentional interference, using their residents as baselines for comparison with experimental vault populations. Vault-13, famous for producing the Vault Dweller, who would save the Wasteland from the Master's super mutant army, was designed to remain sealed for 200 years with no experimental variables beyond the extreme duration of isolation. But even Vault-13's story illustrated Vault-Tec's casual cruelty. The Vault's water chip, a critical component of their water purification system, was designed to fail after a specific period, forcing the Overseer to send someone into the Wasteland to find a replacement. This wasn't accidental failure. It was engineered, a deliberate addition to even a control vault to generate data about how isolated populations would respond to critical system failures and the necessity of surface contact. The Vault Dwellers' journey, their survival in the Wasteland and eventual heroism, was never supposed to happen. Vault-Tec expected that sending someone out would result in their death from radiation, mutants, or simple inability to navigate post-war reality. That it worked out differently was luck and individual capability, not evidence that Vault-Tec's designs served their residents' interests. By contrast, vaults with extreme social or psychological experiments collapsed into violence, dispersion, or the formation of new surface groups, including raider gangs, and settlements noted in later game timelines. Vault-15, designed with extreme ideological diversity, eventually opened and dispersed its population into the Wasteland, where they formed multiple distinct communities, including the settlement that would become Shady Sands and various raider tribes that plagued the region for decades. The violence of these openings was often extraordinary. Vault populations that had been stressed to breaking points by years or decades of experimentation emerged traumatized, armed with Vault-Tec equipment and willing to use wasteland savagery to survive. Some became raiders specifically because Vault-Tec's experiments had destroyed their capacity for trust or cooperation. Others formed tight-knit communities, bonded by shared trauma, suspicious of outsiders because they had learned that authority figures, like Vault-Tec, would betray and harm them. Certain Vault experiments produced directly observable large-scale effects on the Wasteland's demographics and ecology. These weren't subtle influences or minor contributions. They were massive, transformative impacts that shaped entire regions and created factions that would dominate post-war politics for centuries. The Master's super mutant army originated from research connected to Vault experimentation, while the forced evolutionary virus was developed separately. The research that led to it was part of the same pre-war institutional complex that produced Vault-Tec's experiments. The ideology was identical. Humans were experimental subjects, ethics were obstacles to progress, and transforming people without consent was acceptable if it generated interesting data. Vaults engineered around radiation exposure created populations with unusual mutations, resistance to contamination, or susceptibility to specific conditions. These populations, when they emerged into the Wasteland, carried genetic modifications that propagated through subsequent generations. The ghouls, those radiation-scarred survivors who gained extended lifespan but lost their appearance and often their sanity, included many former Vault residents who had been deliberately exposed as part of Vault-Tec experiments. Other experiments in dependence and addiction cycles, psychological stress laboratories, or rigid class structures tended to disintegrate into internal conflict, with survivors emerging as traumatized or hardened populations that influenced nearby regions through violence, trade, or cultural norms. These vaults produced the Wasteland's most dangerous raiders, its most suspicious isolationists, its most rigid hierarchical communities. One vault was filled with addictive substances and monitored to observe dependence development and social breakdown. When it opened, the survivors were already addicted, desperate, and willing to do anything for their next fix. They became the core of a regional drug trade, spreading addiction and violence throughout their territory. Vault-Tec had created the Wasteland's drug problem deliberately, as an experiment, and then released it to destroy countless additional lives beyond those they had already ruined. Another vault implemented rigid class segregation, dividing residents into upper and lower sections with wildly different living conditions. The experiment was designed to observe class conflict and potential revolution. It ended, predictably, in violence. The lower section eventually rebelled, killed the upper section residents and the overseer, and emerged into the wasteland with a burning hatred of inequality that translated into brutal enforcement of resource sharing in their region. Vault-Tec had created communist raiders, essentially people so traumatized by artificial class division that they imposed violent egalitarianism on everyone they encountered. A small number of projects aimed at universal cures, advanced medical research, or idealized social models either failed or were compromised by overseer decisions, but still left behind experimental data, unique technologies, and occasionally relatively stable survivor communities. These were the experiments where Vault-Tec's scientific pretensions were most visible. They genuinely believed they might discover something valuable, might produce breakthroughs that would justify their methods. But even these successful experiments were still monstrous. Research conducted without consent is unethical regardless of outcome. Medical advances achieved through human experimentation are tainted by their origin, and the communities that survived these experiments were profoundly shaped by them, carrying psychological scars and cultural distortions that influenced their post-war development in ways that couldn't be separated from their vault experience. Some vaults were designed to test alternative government structures, direct democracy, anarchism, technocracy, various forms of autocracy. These experiments produced mixed results, but the data was useless because the conditions were so artificial. A vault isn't a normal society. It's a pressure cooker, isolated and constrained in ways that make any political system perform differently than it would in normal circumstances. Vault-Tec collected reams of information about governance that couldn't be applied to actual political theory because the experimental conditions invalidated any conclusions. The hubris of Vault-Tec's scientific pretensions was that they believed artificial conditions could produce generalizable knowledge. They thought sealing people in underground boxes and torturing them would reveal fundamental truths about human nature. But all it revealed was how people respond to being sealed in underground boxes and tortured, which is to say, badly, unpredictably, and in ways that tell you nothing about how they would behave under normal circumstances. Centuries after the Great War, Vault-Tec no longer functions as an active corporation, yet its vaults, branded technology, and recorded directives remain embedded in the physical and cultural landscape of the wasteland. The company's physical presence is everywhere. Vault entrances dotting the landscape, their massive gear-shaped doors sealed or broken, their interiors preserved or decayed depending on circumstances. Wastelanders encounter sealed, failed, or partially functioning vaults as sources of advanced technology, hazardous experimental byproducts, and historical records that reveal the scale and intent of Vault-Tec's pre-war projects. Every vault that opens is a potential treasure trove: functioning equipment, preserved supplies, technology that has survived centuries. But every vault is also a potential death trap: failed experiments that released radiation or biological hazards, automated defenses still following ancient protocols, experimental subjects who have become dangerous after generations of isolation. The psychological impact of discovering what Vault-Tec actually did cannot be overstated. Wastelanders who grew up hearing stories about the vaults as salvation, who believed that their ancestors were saved by corporate benevolence and government foresight, eventually learned the truth: that most vaults were designed to fail, that Vault-Tec deliberately killed the people who trusted them, that pre-war civilization was even more monstrous than the post-war wasteland it created. This revelation shapes how post-war societies understand both the past and their own attempts at rebuilding. If the pre-war government and corporations could do this, could implement something as horrific as the Societal Preservation Program, then maybe the Great War wasn't an accident or a failure, but an inevitable result of the system that produced it. Maybe the pre-war world deserved to end. Maybe trying to rebuild pre-war civilization is trying to rebuild the very thing that led to apocalypse. Across multiple regions and eras, Vault-Tec stands as a symbol of pre-war hubris, corporate authoritarianism, and the willingness of powerful institutions to sacrifice populations in the name of progress, data, and control. The company represents everything wrong with the pre-war world: the merger of corporate and governmental power, the abandonment of ethics in pursuit of knowledge, the treatment of human beings as resources to be exploited, the belief that technical sophistication justified moral bankruptcy. But Vault-Tec also reveals something important about how institutional evil functions. The corporation didn't succeed despite being monstrous. It succeeded because it was monstrous in ways that aligned with existing power structures. The government wanted human experimentation data and was willing to fund it. Shareholders wanted profits and didn't care how they were generated. Employees wanted careers and convinced themselves that following orders absolved them of responsibility. The system worked exactly as designed, which is why it produced such horrific outcomes. The legacy of Vault-Tec in the wasteland is therefore doubled: the practical legacy of vaults, technology, and affected populations, and the ideological legacy of demonstrating how far institutional power can fall when unchecked by ethics, law, or accountability. Every wastelander who enters a vault and discovers its purpose has to confront the reality that this wasn't an aberration or a mistake, but a deliberate choice made by educated, sophisticated people who had every opportunity to do something different. The Vault Boy mascot, still visible on terminals and posters throughout the wasteland, takes on dark irony in this context. That cheerful thumbs up, that optimistic smile, it was always a lie, always propaganda designed to obscure the truth of what Vault-Tec actually was. Seeing Vault Boy in a facility designed for human experimentation reveals the symbol's true meaning: institutional evil presenting itself as friendly and helpful, corporate cruelty disguised as civic responsibility, mass murder marketed as salvation. Some wasteland communities have adopted Vault-Tec technology while rejecting its ideology, using Pip-Boys and Gex and other equipment while understanding that the corporation that made them was fundamentally corrupt. Others refuse to use anything associated with Vault-Tec, seeing the technology itself as tainted by its origin. And some try to find middle ground, acknowledging both the utility of what Vault-Tec created and the horror of why they created it. The debate about what to do with Vault-Tec's legacy reflects broader questions about how post-war civilization should relate to the pre-war world. Should useful technology be preserved and used despite its evil origins? Should knowledge gained through unethical means be applied to solve current problems? Can institutions and technologies be separated from the ideologies and purposes that produced them? These questions have no simple answers, which is perhaps Vault-Tec's most enduring legacy. The moral complexity of inheriting a world built partially on atrocity, the challenge of using tools created by evil people for good purposes, the difficulty of honoring victims while still benefiting from the systems that victimized them. The vaults that remain sealed present their own ethical challenges. Wastelanders occasionally discover functioning vaults still occupied by populations that don't know the truth about their situation or about the war's end. Should these vaults be opened, exposing residents to wasteland dangers but freeing them from their prison? Should they be left sealed, preserving their isolation but also maintaining whatever experiments Vault-Tec designed for them? Who has the right to make these decisions, and what responsibilities come with that power? Some vaults have become permanent settlements, their residents choosing to remain underground even after learning they could leave. For these communities, the vault isn't a prison, but a home, however complicated its history. They have adapted Vault-Tec's designs to their own purposes, maintained the technologies that serve them, and created new cultures that blend Vault and Wasteland influences. These communities show that spaces built for evil can be reclaimed and transformed, that human resilience can outlast institutional cruelty. Other vaults have been abandoned, sealed permanently, or left open to the wasteland, their contents scavenged and their purposes forgotten. These ruins serve as monuments, intentional or not, to Vault-Tec's crimes and their victims. Entering an abandoned vault, seeing the living quarters where people were experimented on, finding the terminals with overseer logs documenting casual cruelty, discovering the remains of those who died in failed experiments. This experience is a form of historical education, teaching wasteland survivors what the pre-war world was actually like beneath its propaganda. The question of justice for Vault-Tec's crimes is complicated by the corporation's complete destruction. There is no one left to punish, no assets to seize, no institutional structure to dismantle. The executives who designed the Societal Preservation Program died centuries ago. The shareholders who profited from government contracts turned to ash in the nuclear fire. The only targets for accountability are the vaults themselves, and destroying them would harm current residents while erasing historical evidence. This absence of accountability frustrates wasteland survivors who learn what was done to their ancestors. There should be trials, punishment, restitution. But there's only ruins and records, evidence of crimes with no criminals left to judge. This frustration sometimes manifests as hatred for anything associated with pre-war civilization, rejection of all advanced technology and governmental structures because they're tainted by association with Vault-Tec and similar institutions. But others draw different lessons. That the absence of institutional accountability makes individual moral responsibility more important. That preventing similar atrocities requires vigilant protection of rights and skepticism of authority. That rebuilding civilization means building something genuinely better rather than recreating the systems that led to apocalypse. Vault-Tec's story, then, is ultimately about power and its abuse. About what happens when institutions become so powerful that they can ignore ethics entirely. About how ordinary people can implement extraordinary evil when embedded in systems that reward cruelty and punish conscience. It's about corporate capitalism taken to its logical extreme, where human life becomes just another resource to be exploited for profit and data. But it's also about resistance and survival, about the people who maintained their humanity despite Vault-Tec's efforts to destroy it, who emerged from the experiments traumatized but not broken, who built new lives and communities from the wreckage of what was done to them. Every wasteland community founded by Vault survivors represents a victory over Vault-Tec's design. Proof that institutional evil cannot completely extinguish human dignity and resilience. The corporation believed it could control human behavior through experimental design, could predict and manipulate how people would respond to various stimuli and conditions. But the wasteland proved them wrong. People adapted in ways Vault-Tec never anticipated, resisted in ways the experiments couldn't account for, and ultimately survived despite rather than because of Vault-Tec's interventions. This is perhaps the most important legacy of Vault-Tec's failure. The demonstration that human beings are not simply variables in experiments, that dignity and agency persist even under conditions designed to destroy them, that institutional power, however sophisticated and comprehensive, cannot completely control human outcomes. The vaults stand throughout the wasteland as monuments to both human evil and human endurance. Evil because of what Vault-Tec did to the people who trusted them. Endurance because those people and their descendants survived and built lives despite those crimes. Every vault tells a story of betrayal and survival, of institutional cruelty and individual resilience, of how the powerful abuse their authority and how the powerless resist and overcome. Vault-Tec is dead. The corporation that sealed thousands of people in underground laboratories, that designed experiments to torture and destroy them, that treated human life as expendable in pursuit of data and control, that corporation was destroyed along with the civilization that enabled it. But its legacy persists in every vault that still stands, in every piece of technology still functioning, in every community still shaped by the experiments conducted on their ancestors. The wasteland inherited Vault-Tec's physical infrastructure and technological achievements. But it also inherited the knowledge of what Vault-Tec actually was. The understanding that the pre-war world was capable of systematic, sophisticated evil disguised as salvation. This knowledge shapes how wasteland societies think about power, about corporations, about government, about the relationship between technological progress and moral purpose. Can you have one without the other? Can you preserve Vault-Tec's useful technologies while rejecting the ideology that created them? Can you build new institutions that avoid Vault-Tec's mistakes while serving similar functions? These questions remain open, contested, and central to how the wasteland imagines its future. What's certain is that Vault-Tec cannot be forgotten or ignored. The corporation's crimes were too vast, its impact too profound, its legacy too embedded in wasteland reality. Every person who uses a Pip-Boy, every community that lives in a vault, every region shaped by populations Vault-Tec experimented on, they all carry forward the story of what was done and what it meant. And that story, ultimately, is a warning that power without accountability becomes tyranny, that technical sophistication without ethical foundation becomes horror, that institutions will become monstrous if allowed to pursue their interests without constraint. Vault-Tec showed what happens when corporate capitalism, government authority, and scientific ambition merge into a system that treats human beings as resources to be exploited. The wasteland has many challenges as it rebuilds: raiders and radiation, mutants and resource scarcity, political conflicts and environmental degradation. But perhaps its greatest challenge is ensuring that whatever civilization emerges from the ruins learns Vault-Tec's lessons, that no institution deserves unlimited power, that no goal justifies abandoning ethics, that human dignity must be protected even when, especially when, powerful interests claim it's expendable for some greater good. Vault-Tec promised salvation and delivered damnation. It promised protection and provided torture. It promised preservation and engineered destruction. The corporation lied about everything except its logo. That cheerful Vault Boy, thumb eternally raised, smile never wavering, silently presiding over the greatest betrayal in human history. The wasteland remembers, the vaults remain, and the legacy of Vault-Tec, both its crimes and the resistance to them, continues to shape the post-war world centuries after the corporation itself turned to radioactive ash.